Well, good afternoon in London and good morning in America. We're absolutely delighted to have Professor Michael Mandelbaum, who is the Christian A. Herter Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies here with us today. And that is one of the great benefits of having changed some of our working methods during the various lockdowns around the world. We've become familiar with technology that's always been here, but now allows us to bring into our sitting rooms people we'd love to hear from, and we're delighted to have you here today, Michael. Now, Michael has brought out a book on the 4 ages of American foreign policy: weak power, great power, superpower, hyperpower. And I'm delighted because many of you won't know this, but at one point, Michael was my teacher at Harvard. And so I was thrilled to have him back on. He claims he doesn't remember, which is probably true because I was not that good a student. But I'm thrilled that he's here today to share his thoughts and his thinking about his book, and we'll get there in a moment. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli, one of the directors at ZN, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce these FS Club webinars because our sponsors are varied and they have varied interests, typically ranging across technology, economics, and finance. But I think the biggest point we're going to be talking about today is we're not here about current affairs. We're not here about liability-driven investment or what the president thinking on this, or is he or she friends with she, or anything like that. We're here to talk about that vast sweep of American history, 200 plus years of it, really from before the formation in 1776, the Constitution reforms in 1789, all the way through. Michael is here presenting us with an extremely broad sweep. Now, to do that, our typical format. We'll let Michael have the floor for 20 minutes, and I'll get out of the way as quickly as I can. And then we have 20 minutes of questions and answers where you, the audience, get to take this discussion where you want it to go. And to do that, please simply type into the chat room any of the questions, and I'll feed them into the discussion with Michael. 3 quick points. One, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be posted in about 2 working days. 2, the slides, such as they are available. But more importantly, there'll be a link to Michael's book, and Michael has made a special point. He brings out a monthly newsletter on American foreign policy, and we will be showing you and putting into the chat room an email link for you to send him if you'd like to receive that. So that's the formalities. All of the questions that you ask will be sent to Michael. So if there are points of detail, or you feel it's not really a question for all of us, or you want to point him to a link, feel free to do so. You can also thank him for appearing, and he'll also add you to the newsletter if you request that. So many ways to contact our speaker today. And just before we get going, we wanted to launch a quick poll, if you don't mind, Sasha. And it was really here just to get a flavor of how the audience feels before we start. We'll ask this poll at the end. Do you think the US's role in the world has been a force for good? Yes, absolutely. Mostly good, mostly neutral, mostly bad, or very bad. And we'll just launch that poll there, and we're away. And Michael, you'll find our audience is fairly opinionated, and this is a quick poll. Whoa! 56%, 70% have voted. I'll leave that open for just a second or two longer. We got most of the audience voted. Closing that poll and sharing the results. And we have here, actually, probably what I would have guessed, but nearly 60% saying mostly good, 26% neutral, and 7% bad, 7% absolutely assured. So, Michael, with no more ado, if I may, the floor is very much yours.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you all. My book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, covers 250 years from 1765 to 2015, and it has 3 purposes. First, it tells the story. It provides a description and explanation of the major events and most important personalities over the sweep of history that I cover. Second, it engages with the principal controversies concerning American foreign policy in this period. So I address such questions as, why did the 13 colonies rebel against the British Empire? Why did the Cold War begin, and why did it end as it did? Which presidents were successful and which unsuccessful in conducting American foreign policy? Spoiler alert, Thomas Jefferson does not come off well. Third, the book is designed to draw out the principal themes that run through the entire history of American foreign policy. What are those themes? Well, the history of American foreign policy, like the history of everything, exhibits both continuities and changes. And the book is structured around the principal continuities and major changes in the history of American foreign policy. I'll say something about each of them, beginning with the continuities. There are, in my view, three major continuities in the history of American foreign policy. In the conduct of its relations with other countries, the United States has historically been unusually ideological, unusually economic, and unusually democratic. What do I mean by that? Well, by unusually ideological, I mean that more than most countries, the United States has attempted to promote its own political values beyond its borders and its own political institutions. The most important values and institutions being democracy within countries and peace among them. Now, the United States is not the only country ever to have sought to promote these values. This was an important theme in the foreign policy of Great Britain in the 19th century and has been important in the foreign policies of the countries of Western Europe, here including Great Britain, since the middle of the last century. Nor has the promotion of American values been the only approach the United States has taken to foreign policy. In fact, historically, there have been two principal approaches. One of them is called realism. It has power at its center. It involves the defense of national interests. And for realists, the best of all possible worlds is a stable balance of power in the international order. The American president most closely identified with realism in the last century was Theodore Roosevelt, who spent a good deal of his presidency trying to promote a stable balance of power in East Asia. The alternative approach is the one that emphasizes values, and the president with whom this approach is most strongly identified is Theodore Roosevelt's great political rival, Woodrow Wilson. At the end of World War I, Wilson sought to promote not a balance of power, but what he called a stable concert of power. And he tried to do so through the international organization that he helped to create at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I, the League of Nations, an organization to which, however, he did not manage to persuade the United States to affiliate itself. The importance of the ideological approach is that it has always been important in American foreign policy, even though it has never really been the dominant tradition. For most of American history, on most foreign policy issues, the country has opted for the realist approach. The defense of American interests has taken precedent, and when interests and values conflicted, Americans have opted to defend their interests. But the Wilsonian approach, the emphasis on the promotion of values, has always been important. It was important even before Woodrow Wilson's time. It has never disappeared. It has always been on the American agenda. And the relative importance of value promotion is one of the things that has made American foreign policy distinctively American. As for its unusually economic foreign policy, this has consisted in a recurrent American effort to use economic instruments to promote political goals. And this goes back to the period before there was an independent United States. The American rebellion against the British Empire, known in the United States as the American Revolution, came about in part because the Parliament in London imposed taxes on the colonials that they regarded as unfair and unjust. An early reaction to those taxes was a boycott of British goods in America in order to put pressure on British merchants so that they would put pressure on the British Parliament to rescind the taxes. And for a while, in a limited sense, this tactic was successful. So the economic sanctions that we see the United States and other countries imposing today on Russia and other countries have a very long history in North America. Between the 18th and the 20th centuries, the principal economic instrument the United States employed in an effort to get other countries to change their policies was trade. But beginning in the 20th century, with a program known as dollar diplomacy in the administration of William Howard Taft, which came between the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the United States also attempted to use the export of capital for political purposes. And that has continued through until now, until the 21st century. The third great continuity is that America has had an unusually democratic foreign policy. And by that I mean that the public, and especially public opinion, has had an unusually large influence on the relations between the United States and other countries. This stands in contrast to what was historically normal in the great powers of Europe, where foreign policy tended to be the preserve of the monarchy and the aristocracies. Well, the United States had neither, and this created space for the public to exert influence. And that influence has been particularly pronounced in matters of war and peace. Public opinion helped to push America into wars. There is a pattern that recurs throughout American history in which a dramatic event takes place, usually overseas, but sometimes within the United States, that galvanizes the American public, that makes the world suddenly seem more dangerous, and that creates a demand for a more robust foreign policy in order to meet the newly perceived danger, which sometimes has spilled over into open warfare. So, for example, in 1898, the sinking of the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor led to a climate of opinion in the United States that made possible the Spanish-American War of that year. Less than 2 decades later, during World War I, a war that the United States was initially determined to stay out of, the German sinking of the passenger ocean liner Lusitania transformed the American perception of Germany and paved the way for the American entry into World War I against the Germans 2 years later, in 1917. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, precipitated official American involvement in World War II, and the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 led to 2 American wars, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. However, public opinion also ended American wars, or at least American participation in particular wars. American public opinion turned against American wars in Korea in the 1950s, in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s, and in Iraq in the first decade of this century. And in each case, public dissatisfaction forced the American administration of the time to withdraw from those wars. Now, it should be noted that in each case, the public did not turn against the goals of the war. Rather, the public decided that while the goals may have been worthy, the price of successfully pursuing them had become too high. And for the American public in each case, the relevant price was measured not in money, but in casualties in American lives. It's also worth noting here that every single American war, without exception, has given rise to dissent and protest, although it has taken different forms in different wars. In the War of American Independence, for example, those colonials who did not wish to join the rebellion against Great Britain simply moved north to Canada, which, of course, remained a part of the British Empire. In World War II, to take another example, the most emphatic and sustained objection to the war came before the United States actually formally entered it. After Pearl Harbor, opposition declined very sharply. Well, those are the continuities. What about the changes? The most important change in the 250 years of American foreign policy that the 4 ages of American foreign policy covered is an increase in the relative power of the United States in the international system. And remember that power in the international system is always relative. That power increased in a way that gave the United States successively 4 distinct international roles that are reflected in the book's subtitle. From 1765 to 1865, the United States was a weak power concerned above all to protect its independence while it engaged in its great 19th century national project of expanding across the United States, across North America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. From 1865 to 1945, the United States was a great power, one among several in the international system. And as a great power, it engaged in the 2 kinds of policies in which great powers ordinarily engage. It both cooperated but also conflicted with other great powers, and it carved out a sphere of influence for itself in the Central American region and in the Eastern Pacific. I should note that it was in this second age of American foreign policy that the United States acquired a formal empire with the annexation of the Philippines in the wake of the Spanish-American War. But it is perhaps also worth noting that compared with the great empires of Europe, the American one came belatedly, was pretty small, and can be characterized as half-hearted, since the United States did not seek to expand it, paid almost no attention to it, and it had very little, if any, impact on the national life of the United States. Well, from 1945 to 1990, the United States was one of 2 superpowers in the international order. And as such, it engaged in a global competition in political, economic, and even military terms with the rival superpower, the Soviet Union. Finally, from 1990 to 2015, the United States was the world's only hyperpower. The term comes from the French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine, who called the United States an hyperpuissance. It was in this era that the United States was at its most powerful. It faced no serious security challenges, and it had no serious rival. How did the United States become so powerful? Well, over the course of 250 years, it consistently expanded its share of what are the basic ingredients of power in the international order. It increased its territory, its population, and its economic output. And in particular, at the end of the 19th century, the United States began to take the lead in the world in mastering the techniques of the Industrial Revolution, which proved in the 20th and 21st centuries to be the key ingredients of disposable power in the world. Now, the Industrial Revolution, of course, began in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, but by the end of the 19th, the United States not only had the largest economy in the world, but it also had placed itself at the cutting edge of innovation in the Industrial Revolution, and it has remained there more or less ever since. A couple of words about war in the history of American foreign policy. War has been important. The United States engaged, by my count, in 12 major wars and many other lesser skirmishes. But I don't think it can be said that the United States has consistently conducted a warlike foreign policy. In each of those major wars, Americans believed that they were fighting for defensive purposes. And in almost all of them, it had a reasonable case, although, of course, other countries saw things differently. The one major exception here was the Spanish-American War of 1846 to 1848, which brought into the Union what are now substantial parts of the American Southwest and the American West. It's also worth noting that in each of its three major wars, the United States benefited from having an unusually good commander-in-chief. In the War of American Independence, George Washington proved to be an adroit battlefield commander, and his battlefield skill consisted mainly of avoiding formal battles with the superior British forces. But he also served as a symbol of the new nation, not only for the soldiers of the American army, but also for the people of the 13 colonies. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln understood what was required to win the war, namely the destruction of the army of the opposing Confederates. He found a general who could execute that strategy, Ulysses S. Grant, and he persevered in that strategy until victory was achieved, despite painful losses and domestic discontent. Finally, in World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt was confronted with a series of important and difficult strategic choices. And the choices that he made, although criticized both at the time and afterward, seemed to me to have been the proper ones. He was right to support Britain and the Soviet Union before the United States formally entered the war, right to adopt the so-called Europe First strategy after Pearl Harbor, in which the brunt of the American military effort went to the European theater rather than Asia, from which the attack that sent the United States into the war had come. Right to make the initial major military operation of the war the invasion of North Africa in 1942, and right to decide on the great American, British, Canadian cross-channel invasion of France to take place in the middle of 1944. I should also note that each of these commanders-in-chief was very good at what is the most important wartime task of the American president, and that is keeping the country committed to fighting. It's also sometimes the most difficult task. Well, what of the present? Where are we now? We're now in the fifth era of American foreign policy. And because the future is, as always, unpredictable, we cannot say what that will ultimately look like. But about this fifth age of American foreign policy, the as yet untitled one, or at least untitled by me, we can, I think, say three things with confidence. We can say that it will be the product of three factors. First, it will be the product of America's relative power in the international system. Second, it will be the product of America's historical predisposition to conduct a foreign policy that is unusually ideological, unusually economic, and also unusually democratic. And third, and last but not least, American foreign policy in the fifth era of the foreign policy of the United States will be the product of the unpredictable contingencies of human history. Thank you.
Michael, that was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. What a clear exposition. And I've got quite a few questions and comments, and folks, I'd like to pick up on them. You reminded me actually of a very funny quote from a friend of mine, Nick Robbins, author of The Corporation That Changed the World, about the East India Company. And when he referred to the Boston Tea Party, he said it was Chinese tea bought with Indian silver by a British company, taxed in the UK, shipped to a colony, and dumped in an American harbor by people dressed as Indians, which is kind of sort of sums it up. Hugh Purser asked a question right off at the start, but I think you've answered it. Could we ask what is the fifth age? But he did have a couple of extra points to this, which I'd like to throw into. Can hyperpower be shared? Is Hugh's comment here? The hyperpuissance.
Well, it was not shared when the United States occupied that role. I believe it's fair to say that although the United States is still the most powerful country in the world, it's not a hyperpower. And it's not a hyperpower because I define hyperpower as a condition in which there are no serious challenges to American power or interest, and no other countries attempting to expand their power to rival the United States. And that is not the case now. That's why I end the fourth age at 2015. In 2015, it was clear that China intended to challenge the United States and was interested in overturning the American-supported global order, at least in part. And we know that Mr. Putin in Russia is interested in doing the same thing. And I might add that in the Middle East, the mullahs of the Islamic Republic of Iran harbor the same ambition. That means that the conditions that obtained between 1990 and 2015, the important ones, no longer hold good. So in that sense, I don't think one can call the United States a hyperpower any longer.
Okay. Clive Bullen is I think picking up on exactly that point. Do you think that the likely US and for that matter UK direction is downwards just because of the size and growth of China and India?
Well, certainly that is true when you look at gross domestic product in a particular way. The United States and other Western countries are continuing to grow, albeit at a lower rate than in the past. But because other countries are growing rapidly, of course, the relative share of the global GDP is declining and will probably continue to decline. That said, however, when it comes to power, we can't be so sure. China is becoming bigger economically, and economic output is the basis of power in the world, but it's not a simple one-for-one correlation. China faces difficulties that could, and I think probably will, limit its power. Its own growth is slowing rather dramatically. Its politics may not continue to be stable. It has a few, if any, friends in the world. And of course, for Russia, the factors diminishing Russian power are even more obvious and even more formidable, not least of which is the Ukrainian army. So although we can predict that the global share of output of the Western countries will decline, I don't think we can be so confident that Western power in general and American power in particular will decline, or at least will decline as steeply, or at least will decline in a way that makes a huge difference in the way we all live. That will depend, to go back to my final comment, on the unpredictable contingencies of human history.
Hmm. Now, Condoleezza Rice is a name we don't hear as much as we used to many years ago, when she was really front and foremost in this. She was asked at one point about whether or not there was a sharp line between power politics and a principled foreign policy based on values. And she replied that this polarized view, you're either a realist or devoted to norms and values, may be just fine in academic debate, but it is a disaster for American foreign policy. American values are universal, which I think underscores that immense issue you talk about, that America has been ideological. But within that ideology, there's almost no ability to influence, because if you believe the values are universal, then one might argue the ideology is unlikely to change. Is that how you feel?
Well, I think it's unfortunately the case that American ideology, and it's Western ideology, it's the political ideas that the United States and Western Europe share, turns out not to be universal, or at least not universally applicable. Here's how I illustrate that in the book. In the first 3 ages of American foreign policy, the United States was successful. It successfully defended its independence as a weak power. It was part of the 2 winning coalitions in the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century as a great power, and it prevailed in the Cold War as the leader of the Western coalition as a hyperpower. But the 4th age broke with this pattern. The United States was not successful. Why was it not successful? Because its major project, although not its only one, was to install a democratic government around the world, in many countries in the world. And it tried in different ways to do so in different places, including Russia and China, Bosnia, Somalia, Haiti. And it didn't work. And it didn't work because although the goal is laudable, and although I think we would all agree, or be inclined to agree, that these countries would themselves be better off with our kind of government, that kind of government has certain preconditions. It requires a certain set of institutions. Those institutions require a certain set of values and a certain set of experiences. Not every country has these. They cannot be developed overnight. They require at least a generation to build, and they cannot be imported from abroad. So for those reasons, although American values have been and will continue to be important, and although the United States will continue to promote its values where and as it can, and although there will always be domestic discontent in the United States about a policy that seems to flaunt American values, the ability of the United States to spread its values around the world, as we learned to our dismay in the 25 years of hyperpower status, is limited.
Hmm. Robert O'Brien would continue on that. He points out that for decades, the conventional wisdom in the US was it was only a matter of time before China would become more liberal, first economically, and then that would result in political liberalism. And he says that we couldn't have been more wrong. It's a miscalculation, what he calls the greatest failure of US foreign policy since the 1930s. Is that really such a big miscalculation?
Well, it's a very good question, and I deal with it extensively in the 4th part of of the four ages of American foreign policy. I call the assumption that the world was moving in that direction the liberal theory of history, and I explain it at some length in the chapters that make up the fourth part of the book. It turned out not to be entirely correct. I think there are two things to be said in defense of the American commitment to that idea. First of all, the historical events of the previous decade seem to provide strong evidence in favor of it. After all, communism collapsed, and all the formerly communist countries in Europe were in the process of trying to install market economies and democratic political systems, and a number of them succeeded, although Russia did not. The second defense of this view is that to some extent it was right in the case of China. China, as a result of the economic reforms instituted under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, became a very different and much more open country than it had been under Mao Zedong. So the liberal theory of history did work up to a point. Individual Chinese became freer, China became a more open country, but China retained its autocratic political system with a monopoly of power in the hands of the Communist Party of China. And the Communist Party did not abandon its ambition, which is not simply a communist ambition, but a Chinese ambition, to become the dominant country in East Asia, if not further. So there was some wishful thinking involved in that American view. But let me add one other point. I'm not quite sure what the alternative was. In theory, if we had seen what was coming, we should have tried to prevent China's economic growth. We should have tried to embargo and boycott China economically. That took place during the Cold War, but the separation of the communist bloc from the rest of the world was self-imposed. China was interested in integrating in the rest of the world, and I don't think the United States could have stopped this. Even if the United States had decided never to do business with China, which was domestically extremely unlikely, I don't think other countries would have followed our lead. So in some sense, what happened was unavoidable.
Okay. We're going to have to speed up a bit, sadly, because I've got lots of questions. So very quickly, on your thesis, Donald McCrae is curious, okay, but during the superpower phase, did U.S. superpower status since 45 correlate with more success in foreign policy and wars, or was it just a superpower and no more successful?
It was successful in two ways. First, it helped to defend, in fact, it was largely responsible for defending what we came to know as the free world. There were plenty of failures in Vietnam, for example, and the oil crisis you could regard as a failure. But that was the principal goal of American foreign policy, and it succeeded. The United States as a superpower also succeeded in winning the Cold War, but that success came, as I described in the third part of the four ages of American foreign policy, really by example. That was not a military victory. That was a victory of the American example and more broadly of the Western example.
Yeah, that sort of soft power argument. Yeah. Douglas Andrews is curious, how would Professor Mandelbaum characterize the Trump foreign policy within the context of the ages that you presented? And I'd like to tack on to that another question comment from Eric Vander Kuch. We're not going to talk too much about current affairs, but he does ask. Eric is director of the Feeling Europe Foundation, and Biden said back in November 2020, America's back, ready to lead the world once again to the head of the table, ready to confront our adversaries, to stand up for our values. And the US-EU relationship is supposed to be very good. And how do you look at the outcome of the midterm elections? And do you see the coming 2024 US presidential elections as, let's call them points of potential serious inflection, or is it just business as usual?
Well, on Trump, he authorized 2 departures from traditional American foreign policy. One is that he took a much more adversarial approach to China, and the country accepted that. That is now the policy of the Biden administration. This disquiet with China was building. Trump crystallized it, and that has become American foreign policy accepted by both parties. Trump was also very suspicious of the NATO alliance. There were times when he seemed to want to abrogate American participation in it, but his administration did not permit that. And in fact, despite his warm words of friendship for Mr. Putin, the Trump administration took a tougher line, in fact, toward Russia than initially the Biden administration did. Now, as for what is to come, that really is unpredictable. And my next essay on foreign affairs that I'll be circulating at the end of this month, and that any of our listeners is welcome to subscribe to by letting me know at the email address indicated, I will deal with that question. What one can say is that there are serious forces working against continuing the global American role, but there are also powerful forces working in favor of it, not least the fact that the foreign policy establishment in both countries, which has greater interest in and influence over foreign policy, although disagreeing on specific issues, the establishment itself is strongly in favor of continuing this global American role.
And if I may, we will be sending all the questions with the emails to you, but just a question from me, if I might end. To me, there was an interesting period during the superpower phase when America seemed to be behind multilateral institutions, you know, the UN, the WTO, the IPA. It was a big force for multilateralism, and it appears to have almost abandoned multilateralism under Trump and maybe before that. And yet, you know, in what I would call beyond the hyperpower phase, or to go back to one of the earlier questions, you know, sharing hyperpower status of various forms, multilateral would appear to me to be the only way to go. And then in addition, we have a few problems. Climate change stands out, obviously, which clearly do need some global approaches. So what are your thoughts on the future of multilateralism in the US?
Well, the United States has been successful since World War I in international security affairs only as part of a coalition, and that will not change. There is a tradition of unilateralism in the United States. There's grumbling about international organizations. There's disillusion with the United Nations, which goes back a long way. And there's some discontent with the International Trade Organization because of the use and misuse that China has made of it. But I think the American commitment to multilateralism, despite endemic grumbling, and remember that there was discontent about the NATO alliance from the very beginning. Discontent, grumbling is inherent. It comes with the territory. But despite that, I believe that the American commitment to basic multilateralism is pretty firm.
Wow. Well, Michael, it really is a delight to see you again, and I thank in many ways the increasing use of new technology. I have 3 rounds of thanks, if I may. Firstly, to our sponsors. You've been absolutely superb, allowing us to range over many subjects, and I hope you found today an interesting and very worthwhile addition to the FS Club catalog. You'll see the events coming up in the future on the next slide. But what I would like to say is just check out the website. No need for me to read that, but we do have a very full program, particularly next week. Finally, you know, I would like to thank you, Michael. It was so kind of you to appear. It's so kind of you to make this generous offer. Folks, do take up Michael on the offer to subscribe to his newsletter. If you missed it, we'll send it in the reminder email that we do when we post the video. But I would like to say what really pleased me today was to have an intelligent discussion looking at the length of foreign policy and not just focusing on the last incident that seemed to have made the news. And it's been a very newsworthy month over here in Britain, I can assure you. we're definitely having a lot. And we are unable, despite all the advanced technology we purport to use, to give you any kind of decent applause. So we have here, in a spirit of multiculturalism, I have my Korean karmic clapper, which I'll have to substitute, I'm afraid, as applause from the audience. But I can see here from folks, and folks do feel free to send in any comments you have, that they've really enjoyed it, and we appreciate your time.
My pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
And best luck with the book sales. Well worth reading, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.